Between 1816 and 1873, the Springfield and the Enfield went through generation after generation of upgrades, and every single change was paid for in battlefield casualties. Millions of rifles, 2 nations, 1 brutal war. Here is what actually happened. 1. Springfield Model 1842. When the Civil War started in April 1861, both sides needed rifles fast. The Union had the Springfield Armory producing at full speed, but full speed still could not keep up with the demand of arming hundreds of thousands of new volunteer soldiers in just a few months. The Confederacy had almost no weapons manufacturing of its own at all. So both sides did the same thing. They went into storage and pulled out the Springfield Model 1842, a rifle that was already 20 years old when the war began. The 1842 had a smooth barrel with no grooves inside it. Every rifle that came after it had grooves, and those grooves are what make a bullet spin, fly straight, and hit accurately at long distances. Without them, the 1842 could only hit a target accurately at 50 to 75 yards. The Springfield 1861 that replaced it could hit accurately at 300 yards. That gap tells you everything about how outdated 1842 was by 1861. But up close, that .69 caliber round hit hard. And in the chaotic opening months of the war, when organization was still being figured out on both sides, the 1842 kept soldiers armed when nothing better was available. Both Union and Confederate soldiers carried it at First Bull Run in July 1861. Once the 1861 Springfield started arriving in large numbers through late 1861 and into 1862, the 1842 moved to militia units and disappeared from the front line completely. 2. Enfield Pattern 1853. Here is something most people do not expect. The Enfield Pattern 1853 was a British rifle, made in England, and yet it became the second most used rifle in the entire American Civil War, carried by soldiers on both the Union and Confederate sides at the same time. Britain exported around 900,000 Enfield rifles to America during the war. The Confederacy received the larger share because the Union already had domestic production running through Springfield. Confederate soldiers relied on the Enfield so heavily that it became their primary battlefield weapon across most major engagements from Bull Run all the way through to Appomattox. The Enfield fired a .577 caliber bullet, slightly larger than the Springfield's .58 caliber. And here is where it gets interesting. The size difference between the two calibers was small enough that Springfield ammunition could be loaded into an Enfield in an emergency. Confederate quartermasters used this interchangeability constantly when resupply lines broke down during long campaigns. The Enfield weighed 8.6 pounds, slightly lighter than the Springfield, and soldiers on both sides noted that it handled more smoothly during extended marching and combat.
It was not as heavy.
British manufacturing standards at the time were among the highest in the world, and the fit and finish on an Enfield was noticeably cleaner than most American-produced rifles of the same period. For Confederate soldiers who were always short on supplies and equipment, getting an Enfield felt like getting something premium in the middle of a war. They were slowly losing the resources to fight. 3. Enfield Pattern 1853. Short rifle. Most soldiers in the Civil War stood in large formations and fired together on command. But there was a smaller group of soldiers who operated completely differently. Sharpshooters worked alone or in pairs, picked their own positions, and targeted specific people on the opposing side. Officers, artillery commanders, flag bearers, men whose loss would hurt the enemy more than a regular soldier falling. For this kind of work, accuracy at long range was everything. The Enfield Pattern 1853 short rifle was built for exactly this role. It was shorter than the standard 1853 infantry rifle, which made it easier to carry and move with quickly. But it kept a longer barrel than the smaller carbine versions, which meant it held onto the long-range accuracy that sharpshooters depended on. It also accepted a sword bayonet, a longer blade than what standard infantry rifles carried, giving the sharpshooter a close-range option if enemy soldiers reached his position. Confederate sharpshooter units operating through the thick forests and narrow valleys of the Shenandoah Valley campaigns in 1862 and 1864 carried the short rifle as their primary weapon. On the Union side, Bourdon's sharpshooters, one of the most respected specialized units of the entire war, documented carrying Enfield variants alongside American-made target rifles throughout their operations. At Gettysburg in July 1863, sharpshooters on both sides used the short rifle from elevated rocky positions to engage targets at distances that regular infantry formations simply could not reach effectively. 4. Enfield Pattern 1853. Two-band rifle by 1863. Confederate supply lines were collapsing, and agents in Europe were scrambling to get whatever rifles they could through the blockade. The Enfield Pattern 1853. Two-band rifle became their primary weapon through the final 2 years of the war. Shorter and lighter than the standard 1853 infantry rifle, It was faster to handle in close combat and easier to carry across long campaigns. At the Siege of Petersburg, which ran from June 1864 through March 1865, Confederate soldiers held their trench positions for 9 straight months. This siege decided the final outcome of the entire war. Unit inventory records from that campaign show the two-band appearing consistently across Confederate defensive positions throughout. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was running low on everything during those final months. Men, food, ammunition, and equipment were all disappearing faster than they could be replaced. The two-band kept soldiers armed when almost nothing else was getting through. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. As Confederate soldiers stacked their weapons, Union officers standing there recorded seeing large numbers of Enfield rifles alongside American-made weapons. The rifle the Confederacy depended on from the first shot to the final surrender was British, built in England and carried by Southern soldiers through 4 years of the deadliest war America ever fought. 5. Springfield Model 1855. This one has a story that most people have never heard, and it explains exactly why the 1861 Springfield became the weapon it was. The Springfield Model 1855 used something called the Maynard tape priming system. A small roll of paper tape with tiny explosive caps embedded in it fed automatically into the firing mechanism, similar in concept to a modern toy cap gun. The idea was to speed up the loading process by removing the step where a soldier had to manually place a percussion cap on the nipple before each shot. Cut that step out, and you save precious seconds during rapid fire. In dry conditions on a testing range, it worked well, but the Civil War was not fought on testing ranges. It was fought in rain, in river mud, in morning frost, and in the humid heat of a Virginia summer. Moisture caused the paper tape to swell, jam inside the mechanism, and misfire at exactly the wrong moments. Soldiers filed complaint after complaint. Officers reported misfires during engagements. The tape system was creating a dangerous reliability problem in the field. By the time the 1861 model arrived, the Army had completely abandoned the tape system and returned to standard percussion caps. The 1855 became the lesson that shaped everything the 1861 got right. Sometimes the most important thing an invention teaches you is exactly what not to do. Which of these massive machines would you trust with your life? Drop a comment below and subscribe for more. 6. Enfield Pattern 1858. Naval rifle. The standard Enfield 1853 was built for infantry soldiers standing in open fields firing in organized lines. But cavalry soldiers had a completely different situation. They were on horseback, moving at speed, fighting in tight spaces, and needed a weapon they could draw, fire, and put away again without losing control of their horse. A full-length rifle was too long, too heavy, and too awkward for any of that. The Enfield Pattern 1858 solved this problem. It was significantly shorter than the 1853 and was originally built for naval boarding parties who needed a compact weapon they could use in the cramped spaces of a ship deck during close combat. When cavalry commanders on both sides of the Civil War saw what it could do, they adopted it for mounted use immediately. General J.E.B. Stuart's Confederate cavalry, the most feared mounted force in the entire war during its early years, carried versions of this weapon throughout their deep raids into Union territory in 1862 and 1863. The Enfield 1858 showed up consistently in Confederate quartermaster records from the Second Bull Run campaign in August 1862 all the way through the Gettysburg campaign in July 1863. It fired the same .577 caliber round as the full-length 1853, which kept ammunition supply simple across infantry and cavalry units fighting in the same area. The shorter barrel did reduce long-range accuracy compared to the full 1853. But Civil War cavalry engagements happened fast, at close range, and mostly in dense terrain like the Virginia woodlands, where long-range accuracy was far less important than getting a shot off quickly while your horse was moving underneath you at full speed. 7. Springfield Model 1861. Over 1 million of these rifles were manufactured and handed to Union soldiers by the end of the war. 1 million. That number alone tells you how much the Union military trusted this weapon above everything else available at the time. It was built at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and fired a .58 caliber Minié ball. Accurate range sat at around 300 yards for a clean shot, and a skilled soldier could push that to 500 yards under good conditions. It weighed 9 pounds, manageable enough for soldiers marching dozens of miles while carrying full gear and rations. The loading process was a sequence. Pour powder down the barrel, push the bullet in after it, ram everything down with a rod, prime the firing cap, then shoot. A well-trained soldier running through that sequence cleanly could fire 3 rounds per minute under battlefield pressure. What made the Springfield 1861 stand out was not any single feature. It was consistent. It performed the same way in rain, in mud, in cold, and in summer heat without breaking down regularly. When you have over 1 million rifles in the field across hundreds of different engagements, consistency is worth more than any special feature. 8. Springfield Model 1861 Cavalry Carbine. The full-length Springfield 1861 was 56 inches long and weighed 9 pounds. Standing in a field, that is fine, but on a horse moving at full speed, it is a completely different situation. Cavalry soldiers needed something they could grab fast, fire, and put back without falling off their horse in the middle of a battle. So they built the Springfield 1861 Cavalry Carbine. Same bullet, same trigger system, just a much shorter barrel and lighter overall. Simple as that. A cavalry soldier could pull it out, shoot, and put it back in the saddle holder without slowing down at all. But here's the thing. Union cavalry was losing badly in the early years of the war. Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart was running circles around Union mounted soldiers. His raids into Union territory were causing real damage and real embarrassment. By 1863, the Union had enough. They reorganized their cavalry, brought in better commanders, and put proper weapons in their hands. The Springfield Carbine was a big part of that. At Yellow Tavern in May 1864, Union cavalry under General Philip Sheridan met Stuart's forces outside Richmond. Stuart got shot and killed in that battle. That single moment ended Confederate cavalry dominance for the rest of the war. 9. Enfield Pattern, 1861. Musketoon infantry soldiers carried full-length rifles. Cavalry soldiers carried shorter carbines, but artillery crews had a completely different job. These men spent their time loading and firing large cannons that could launch an iron ball over a mile. They were not frontline fighters. They were cannon operators, but they still needed a personal weapon for the moments when enemy soldiers reached their position, and that weapon could not get in the way of operating the cannon. The Enfield Pattern, 1861. Musketoon was built for exactly this. Shorter and lighter than both the 1853 and the 1858, small enough to be slung across the back while working the cannon, but powerful enough to stop enemy soldiers at close range when the fight came to them. Confederate artillery crews used the musketoon heavily throughout the war. At the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, Confederate artillery crews came under direct assault from Union infantry pushing toward their gun positions. While keeping their cannons firing, they used the musketoon to defend themselves at close range simultaneously. The Confederacy was always short on supplies. British Enfield variants were coming through the naval blockade in limited quantities, and artillery commanders took whatever version arrived. The musketoon was compact, reliable, and used the same ammunition as every other Enfield already in Confederate hands. That last part mattered more than anything else. 10. Springfield Model 1863. 2 years into the war, Union soldiers had put the 1861 through every possible condition: rain, river crossings, muddy trenches, and sustained rapid fire across major engagements. And they came back with specific complaints. The Army listened. The Springfield Model 1863 was the direct result of that feedback. The lock mechanism got simplified, reducing the number of individual components and cutting down the points of mechanical failure during extended campaigns. The barrel bands holding the wooden stock together were redesigned so soldiers could disassemble and clean the rifle faster between engagements without needing special tools. Around 273,000 Model 1863 rifles were produced before the war ended. They did not replace the 1861 already in the field. Both models ran alongside each other through the final 2 years of the war, and because the core design was identical, soldiers switching between the two needed zero retraining. The most important change was the ramrod. The 1861 ramrod had a tendency to stick inside the barrel after heavy use when powder fouling built up. In the middle of a firefight, a stuck ramrod meant a soldier could not reload. The 1863 addressed this with a smoother-fitting ramrod that held up through sustained rapid firing during major engagements like Gettysburg in July 1863 and Cold Harbor in June 1864. Small change, massive difference when thousands of men were firing as fast as they physically could. The Springfield and the Enfield were more than just wood and iron. They were the ultimate power players of the entire era. Thanks for watching. If you want more real talk on legendary gear, hit that follow button.